I know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
The Chris Johnston Show.
What is going on?
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
Part of the game.
CJ, the money flew fast and furious yesterday, first day of NHL free agency. We were looking at your free agent board before we got going here. I think Jack Roslovic, at the time of this recording, might be the best available free agent left on your board, but that could easily change as we go through today and the rest of the week.
Well, yeah, the reality is if you're a free agent and you didn't sign on July 1st, it's not going to be too comfortable. I mean, there's a few names out there. Vladimir Tarasenko, still unsigned. Some veterans like Ryan Suter, who I don't think are going to have trouble getting work. But, the kind of cantilever of a day like yesterday is all that money gets spent. And then suddenly when the dust settles, there's not a lot of money left around the league. Not a lot of teams with spots to fill. And so that was as wild a free agent day as I can recall in some time, maybe ever. Certainly we've seen some times over the years where there's been a number of huge contracts doled out, but there was so much so quickly that it is a giant game of musical chairs. And, there's more money now in the system. Teams had more money to spend. And, I think it's been a pretty busy last couple of weeks, all in all, across the league of things getting shaken up.
Absolutely. From Frank Saravalli, can't believe Cap Friendly is going away in a few days. Drastically changes the way myself and many NHL front offices do their jobs. They've noted history. Today, being July 1st, is the first day in league history that $1 billion in total contract dollars was doled out in a single day. $1 billion. That's how much money was flying.
The NBA calls that Tuesday. But I mean, just you see some of the numbers that get thrown around in the other pro sports. But yeah, I mean, it was a lot. Obviously not all of these contracts are going to age great. But that being said, I didn't think that there was like so many totally indefensible, hard to understand. I mean, if anything, you might worry about the term that some of the older players got, being signed at premium dollar values into age 37, 38, 39. Obviously there's risk with all those deals, but I mean, I just think that with the cap going up, players are going to get paid more too. I mean, that's part and parcel of this. I mean, maybe the biggest surprise, and I use that term lightly, is someone like, Reinhart gets less than $9 million in that environment after a 57 goal season, after scoring the game winning goal in Game 7 of the Cup final in the last week and having a tremendous year and really being a contributor, all over the ice. Very, very strong two-way player, not just one who produces offense and all those goals. The Panthers managed to keep him at a reasonable number. That might be the most surprising thing of all. And, I do think if Sam Reinhart was inclined to go to market, he would have got paid more in terms of the AAV anyway. I mean, he gets an 8th year in Florida, which is a bonus, but it was a pretty wild day. It was, my phone, it's the next morning and I plugged it in somehow and it's still at 54%. Like I feel I just feel like I can't get it back to 100% just because it's been so much activity, obviously so much texting and calling and trying to stay on top of things.
Okay, last unnecessary question before we delve into who hasn't been signed or traded. Just because I know people are going to ask, I think every year we've done this podcast, we ask this question on free agency. What did you eat at the trade breaker desk?
I had a salad and a roast beef sandwich.
Okay.
It was pretty good actually.
All right.
Yeah, like a trade deadline, we do it up a little bit more fancy and we actually like pre-order a meal. Like there's like a menu that goes around 2 weeks before. This one, like there was a variety of options, but it was just like go and grab one off the table. And I went with the roast beef sandwich. I'm sure someone could have screen grabbed if you cared, me in the background, like knee deep into the roast beef sandwich. But I mean, there is a reality, like you're on TV for whatever 6 or 7 hours straight. You're supposed to be on set the whole time and you got to eat. So, and quite honestly, this will be hard to explain, but when you're there and especially having done it so much, you actually forget when you're not even totally aware of when we're on air or not. Like because I'm kind of just doing my own thing over on the the insider desk there with Bob McKenzie, Darren Dreger, Gord Miller, and Pierre LeBrun. So like we're often in our own conversations. Obviously, we're sharing a lot of info and chasing down news and what we're hearing. And so you're not even really aware. Then all of a sudden there's like a Plinko board in the middle of the studio.
I love that board. That was awesome.
Right. Or there's like Brian Hayes and Carlo Koliakovo in like bright red suits. And I'm like, what is going on? Because I have like nothing. Here's the thing. I have nothing to do at all with that aspect of the broadcast. Like I'm thankful we do all that stuff because it gives us more time to actually try to chase down the news aspect of the job. But I have no idea what's going on half the time. And so, yeah, if you saw me eating a roast beef sandwich on your Canada Day, I'm sorry about that.
I hate to tell you, someone definitely screen grabbed.
Like you've seen it?
Video. I have seen the video. There's a video of you just like eating something.
Man's got to eat, Julian. Man's got to eat.
Okay,
I need energy for these to use these two thumbs to be texting up the world. You know, like
you're not wrong. You're not wrong for that at all. It's just funny to see you just chomp down on the sandwich.
My goodness.
All right. Let's get to the people who, as
the whole
of
thing
now,
is absurd though when you think about it.
It
really
is. Oh, it is. It absolutely is. But that's why
like there is no lunch break, right? Like that's
no.
Like there's just nowhere to go. Like obviously, if you have to use the washroom, you can find a time to walk off. But other than that, like you're like just sit at that desk all day long, just tweeting like a maniac.
We appreciated the tweeting and the intense work you did on July 1st, Big Money Siege. All right, tell me what you're hearing about guys who, as of now, have not been signed or traded. I know we kind of touched on it with Vladimir Tarasenko earlier in the morning on Tuesday. We saw a report from Josh Yohe where the Pittsburgh Penguins threw out an offer at Vladimir Tarasenko. They don't have that much in terms of cap space, but still looking to try to get him anyway. What are you hearing about Vladimir?
Well, I think he'd rather stay in Florida than go anywhere else. I mean, if you remember at the trade deadline when he had a full no trade clause situation in his contract, he basically forced his way to Florida, even though Ottawa didn't end up getting much of a return for him because he so badly wanted to play there. And he was a good fit with the Panthers. He just won a second Stanley Cup. So you can understand why he would be anxious or interested to remain with the Panthers. But they have a lot of different situations. I mean, they've said goodbye to the Lamborghini here going to Calgary. Brandon Montour gets a massive deal in Seattle. They've had a lot of moving pieces. Oliver Ekman-Larsson moved on and signed with the Maple Leafs. So, we'll see if something works in Florida. If not, he'll have some options. And, last year, actually, Tarasenko went unsigned into August before the Senators finally got his signature on a deal. So, as I say, if you didn't sign on July 1st, like obviously we're going to see July 2nd and 3rd signings, but it will go to a drip pretty quickly. And some of the players, even if they have a name or a resume, they might have to wait a little while for the next best deal, because now what teams will be doing is they'll be saying, you didn't, like, everybody signed yesterday, but you didn't. You don't have a lot of options. We're going to try to get you below market for this. And then the player's going to say, well, I'm not going to take that. And then the dance goes on through the summer. So and that's not a prediction for Tarasenko. I do think some of his situation is directly tied to what Florida does and doesn't do. And let's face it, we're only a week since they won the Stanley Cup. So there's been a lot to deal with and contend with in the Panthers front office, squeezing in a draft between a Stanley Cup celebration, a parade celebration, then free agency. So I think that's where he's at. And honestly, there's not a lot to be resolved around the league. Like this is an unusual free agency. It's not normal. I think it's 62 of the 75 names that I had on the free agent board signed on day one, or maybe on June 30th, some of the guys that re-signed, like Patrick Kane, who was on the board at that point. But there's not a lot left unresolved. It's more now what happens. We're almost thinking about the 2025 free agents, the Mitch Marners, who needs a new contract by this time next year. Leon Draisaitl in Edmonton. I think that situation is going to take some time, but those are things that we'll look for over the summer. The Martin Necas situation in Carolina will be interesting, because certainly there were teams that had trade talks with the Hurricanes on him. But, I think some of the urgency goes away when you've missed the window where maybe they, can get a draft pick back. It's not to say he won't be traded, but he also needs a contract. He's a restricted free agent. So does Carolina try to convince him to stay? Is there a way to patch this up? Jacob Trouba's situation is out there, but I don't think I mean, look, there's probably gonna be one or two of those, maybe those situations result in something that's interesting over the summer, but I hate to tell you, you might as well fold up shop here on the NHL offseason. Like, I don't see like a lot of fireworks from now on. Like there could be one or two major fireworks. Like obviously if we talk about a Mitch Marner trade or re-signing, or if we talk about a Leon Draisaitl trade or re-signing or not, like those situations are compelling and interesting. And I think they're big business decisions for the Leafs and Oilers in particular there. You know, I don't know what happens with Natchez. You know, Trouba, I suppose there could still be a trade. Obviously as of Monday, he's only got a modified no trade, so he can only basically block trades to half the league. That means there's a whole other half the league that the Rangers don't need his permission. They could trade him. And obviously it's apparent he doesn't want to be traded, but I don't see, quite honestly, a lot of business just got done in a 4-day window, and I don't see a lot left to do, which is probably good because our podcast will soon be going on hiatus. And so I don't think we're going to miss too much, quite honestly.
He says that now, but I can't wait until the big whatever big trade happens, and all of a sudden I'm doing a podcast from my parents' place in Montreal. I can't wait for the emergency pod in August, CJ.
See, here's the thing. I'm down for that, but you know, if we did this thing right through the summer, I think there'd be a lot of episodes where we're like arguing about food or you know, playing trivia and movie games, or like there would be a lot of filler because I really do think that like so much of the league's business got done. Like I think more than ever. I don't know how to quantify that. I mean, you mentioned the stat about the most money in total contracts given out. You know, let's face it. Like I've heard that there was like business being done back to the combine at the start of June. Like even though it ends up being free agency day, July 1st, I think we just went through free agency month where a lot of discussions went on. Not accusing anything of any wrongdoing, but just saying that I think you don't have that many signings in one day without a lot of work being done ahead of time. And honestly, I mean, you saw the reporting we were doing in the 36 hours leading up to noon on July 1st. I mean, a lot of those deals were already done or handshaked on and just needed to be put on paper officially yesterday.
I was told there would be tampering rules in place to kind of curb some of that stuff.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, I don't mind this. Like these are big decisions for the teams and the players. I think it's sort of unreasonable to think that nobody would talk and then it just opens and then everyone's got to make a bunch of big decisions. Like, you know, look, there's probably someone out there that maybe feels they were burned by this, but I don't think anything truly illegal happened. Like, I guess it's against maybe some of the spirit of the rules, but you know, my sense too is the league doesn't have much problem with the optics of this. I don't know how you ever prevent it. I mean, the truth is teams are subject to tampering rules, but I don't think that agents are. I mean, agents aren't employed by the league.
No.
And, you know, obviously just as a function of the way the league works, agents have to talk to team people. Like, I guess I can't work up a whole bunch of, I think it's a big sort of who gives a shit, frankly. Like, I just don't, I would just put it this way. If I was making a massive decision for my family, for my life, I wouldn't mind a couple weeks to think about it and work through it. And so I think that's a little bit of what happens. Obviously there's a few players though, more than a few. There's some players yesterday that literally woke up not sure exactly where they were signing, probably had to make a quick call, like a quick decision between one option or another. You know, you look at some of the contracts signed, you know, in the evening on July 1st, I'm looking at Jeff Skinner, Adam Henrique, guys like that. I know for sure had multiple offers on the table, and they're probably a little bit cognizant, or their agents, of what I'm talking about. Like if you don't get your chairs aligned in the first couple days, it could be a long summer of that hanging over you. And that's even worse because there's a practical part of that. It's like, you don't know where you're moving. If you have kids, like you don't know where they're going to school. Like it's nice to get this locked in on July 1st. And now you know, obviously players are training and getting ready sort of physically for the next season, but they have to do a lot of planning and things off ice too. And so I think it's just, it kind of is what it is. That's where I land on this. There clearly was, I don't want to use the T word because it's so legal and it sounds like you're like really like, but there clearly was some chair arranging ahead of time.
You could just say it.
Yeah, but I don't know. Is it really? I guess it's tampering by the CBA, but I don't know. I just can't get that fired up about it.
To your point, though, like I was talking with Ryan Lomberg yesterday, actually, and
The Lamborghini.
The Lamborghini, and we've seen videos of him celebrating the Florida Panthers Stanley Cup victory. He's crowd surfing.
The man never wears a shirt. That's my observation.
It was insane. Dude's walking around with a championship belt. He's dousing people with beer. This guy, like, after he wins the Stanley Cup, like he had a feeling that he was probably going to hit free agency. Dude just avoided his agents as long as he could to just try to live in the moment. And he, up until yesterday, he had no idea what was going to happen to him. So you talk about guys who have been discussing for weeks potentially about their futures. Like, there are guys like Lamborghini who Lamborghini, it's a funny nickname, but there are guys like him who up until yesterday, they had no idea what was going on because their minds were just completely elsewhere. And funny enough with the Panthers, I mean, him, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Brenton Montour, so many guys from that team, Vladimir Tarasenko, presumably, so many guys from that team are going to get broken up. And yeah, they can live in that moment forever where they won, but so many decisions to be made in such a small span of time. I thought a lot about the Florida Panthers yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, it's unique, right? And it's similar for the Edmonton Oilers. I think Edmonton did a nice job. They retained a lot of their key players on pretty reasonable deals. I'm thinking of Connor Brown, Matthias Janmark, Henrique, who they got at the trade deadline. Signing those guys all to come back is, I think a positive for them after the season they had. It's a reminder, players, like, obviously some players come into free agency and absolutely, and it should be their priority is to make as much money as they can. It's going to the highest bidder. That's probably the best way to explain how anyone signed in San Jose yesterday. But, I will say that what you learn from seeing the free agency too is players want to win. And Edmonton getting as far as they did, they lose by a goal in Game 7 of the Cup final. Then you got someone like Jeff Skinner off his buyout where he had lots of options. I mean, he's playing on a 1-year, $3 million contract. I know he's getting paid by Buffalo, so he's still doing that pretty well financially. But he's going there clearly to win. I mean, he could have signed for 1 year and $3 million in about 10 spots. I know the Leafs were among the teams that had talked to him and. We're trying to pitch him in on the idea, hey, you can play alongside Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner on our team. So, free agency is about different things to different players. And, I see in Edmonton, getting Connor Brown to stay 1 year, $1 million. Like, I'm sure he could have got more on the market. Even Janmark, 1.4 million times 3. Like, these guys want to be on a winning team and they really believe in what Edmonton's done. And so, yeah, there's a variety of things that play out. And, obviously everyone in Florida would stay there if they could, but because it's such a great living situation, that's, again, the team that just was the best in the league, really the last few years. They won a President's Trophy a couple years ago, been to back-to-back Cup finals and then won this most recent one, but there's not room for everybody. And so, yeah, they're in a particularly unique situation. When I'm talking about deals starting to be cooked at the Combine, that's for players whose seasons were already over. I mean,
of course.
The guys who played up until June 24th, they just had to deal with either the excitement of winning and everything that comes with it, or the pain of losing and everything that comes with it, and then make a decision. Because there's just no functional way to do that when you're in the Cup final. There's no negotiating going on. I mean, I'm sure there's conversations that are along the lines of, "Hey, we like your guy, and when this ends, let's get to work." But I don't think you're throwing numbers back and forth, or because it's just too important to try to win. I think they're all going to do pretty well anyway. So the Lamborghini are sober up at some point here and find his way to Calgary and be a good energy guy for the Flames.
For sure. I want to stay in the state of Florida. Since we were talking about the Panthers, we should talk about the Tampa Bay Lightning and what it's been like for them the last few days. So this morning, before we started, they signed Victor Hedman to a new contract with 4 years, $8 million AAV. Kind of similar to what Steven Stamkos signed in Nashville, and we should get in on that. What do you mean similar?
It's the exact. I don't know if the structure's the same, but it's the same dollar amount and the same number of years.
It's the same. I was kind of playing around with that. You're right. It's the exact same contract. We should get into that situation because I have to get adjusted to Steven Stamkos in a completely different uniform, and Julian Brisebois saying that he's disappointed. He himself, I mean, and obviously Stamkos disappointed in how it all kind of turned out. that is quite the story in itself. What did you think of what happened with Tampa Bay over the last few days?
Well, all you need to know to understand this is it's basically right at the intersection of emotion and cold, hard business. And right at that intersection is where we find the answer to how this all played out. Because on one hand, when Julian Brisebois spoke to reporters, he's talking about the emotion he knows the fans are going through, the emotions he went through personally, the emotions he can imagine Steven Stamkos and his family are going through. But then he's also saying, we've got a better chance at winning championships by doing what we did. And that's hard in sports, right? Because like part of sports is like, if you grew up in Tampa as a hockey fan, like, do you know how many 91 sweaters and jerseys there are in that city? Like that guy he was kind of hailed as a bit of a savior when he was drafted first overall in 2008. You know, he's been a member of the Lightning organization for more than half of the Lightning organization's time in existence. So, you know, that it's hard to get used to someone like that. And look at, Steven Stamkos has gone through all kinds of things in his career. I mean, maybe one of the most underappreciated parts of his career is how he's consistently come back from significant injuries and still found a way to be an effective player, because that's not easy to do. I think mentally, I mean, obviously there's physical challenge in it, but like mentally to be able to push and get yourself back to the top of the mountain so often. I mean, this guy just scored 40 goals. He's 34 years old, which, you know, young in human years, but that's getting up there in NHL years. And he still found a way to be a contributor. And for as much as he's done on the ice, I think he's done more off the ice in that community, in that dressing room for that organization. And they coldly let him walk. No other way to say it.
They signed another franchise player to the exact same contract he signs elsewhere.
Well, here's what I'll tell you. This is what they're saying without saying it. They're saying that you can more easily replace what Steven Stamkos does, and they feel they've done that in acquiring Jake Guentzel and signing him, than what Victor Hedman does. That is the statement I take from that. I'm not saying they wouldn't want to keep Steven Stamkos. There's just hard decisions to be made in a cap world. Julian Brisebois is not afraid of a hard decision. Some of his colleagues are, frankly. You know, most teams with a player like Stamkos would just sign him as long as he wants to play. They'd live with the decline. They'd live with the fact he might be overpaid at the end of his career. They just want to keep that player. You know, Julian Brisebois wants to hang more banners in Amalie Arena. I don't know if he's going to be able to do it. I still question whether they're better heading into next season than they would be without Stamkos, but where they probably are better is they're better positioned, maybe not just for next season, but the 3 or 4 beyond it. Because, you know, they've added Connor Geekie, a pretty well-regarded prospect. They've added J.J. Moser, a 24-year-old defenseman who certainly is still entering his prime years. And at the same time, they've replaced in the short term, essentially Guentzel replaces Stamkos, and they reacquired Ryan McDonough earlier this offseason to replace Sergachev, who was traded to Utah at the draft. And so they've pivoted on the fly to being younger. And so again, they may not be better in the short term to start next season, but there's a lot to there's something to grow into there. But it's hard. And, you know, Steven Stamkos is such a smart guy. Like, he's really attuned, I think, to the business of the game. Like, I don't know if you heard his interview he did with James Duthie on TSN during our show yesterday. Like, he was so honest. I mean, one thing I've always loved about dealing with Stamkos is I've always found him to be very thoughtful, honest, meets questions head on, really thinks about things. This was hard for him. You know, I think he feels a little disrespected. You know, he didn't say that, but it's implied. And I'll give you some facts here, Julian. When Steven Stamkos' entry-level contract ended, way back when, I believe it was in 2010, 2011, something like that, he became an RFA. Like, he played out all 3 years of the ELC, and for 17 days, he was an RFA before getting his next deal. So he had to wait. Victor Hedman, his first deal, he's extended 7 months before it ended. Comes to Steven Stamkos, the end of his second deal. We all remember this. He got into that free agent window that used to happen. He peeked behind the curtain. He re-signs with Tampa 2 days before he could be a UFA. Victor Hedman, after his second deal, well, he didn't even get to the end of it. He got a full year out. He got an extension. Here we are. Steven Stamkos went right down to this last week, at least having discussions with the Lightning. Ultimately isn't re-signed. Victor Hedman, 355 days before he could be a UFA, is re-signed. And so I'm not saying there aren't reasons for it, but he has been treated quite differently than the man who was picked second overall in 2009 than the one who was picked first overall in 2008. They're tremendous buddies, Stamkos and Hedman, lifelong friends, had so much success together. But, if you're Stamkos, I think you're looking around going, like, what gives here? Everybody else gets prioritized, and they've played hardball with him 3 straight times and ultimately let him walk out the door this time. So, I think he'll quickly pivot now. Like, suddenly Nashville is a team. I know that usually winning free agency doesn't mean you necessarily win, but I have to say, I like what the Predators did. And they had a better season than a lot of us expected last year. At least got into the playoffs. And now you're adding, like, one thing they were really missing was offense. You had Marchessault and Stamkos. You're adding Brady Shea is like a difference maker for me on their blue line. You already have Roman Josi there. You get UC Saros extended. And you still got potentially Askarov, their prospect goaltender, to trade. And if they trade him, they'll be getting something significant back. I mean, I think in the short term, I'm not calling Nashville like a favorite to win the cup or anything, but they certainly, like, they're all of a sudden a team to be reckoned with for the next year or 2 or 3. And so I think that'll be exciting for Stamkos. He's really close friends with Luke Shen, who signed last year as a free agent in Nashville. I actually texted a bit with Luke yesterday. He said that they had lots of conversations, but he wasn't pushing Stamkos. He's like, I know it was such a big decision. Like, he didn't apply any pressure. He wasn't like, come on, buddy, get over here. But he certainly probably sung all the positive aspects of it. And life moves on. Like, look at this happens in other industries. It certainly happens in pro sports. Just as many athletes spend a whole career in one place, you still get lots that don't. And Jerome McGinley is still a legend in Calgary, and he went and played for a bunch of teams. Ryan Smith still gets rolled out in Edmonton during the Cup final. I was there and celebrated, and he went and played for a bunch of different teams. I know Stamkos is on probably, maybe not the end of Ginla, but certainly the Ryan Smith. But he's on maybe a different level because he won 2 Stanley Cups. And I mean, we're talking absolute first ballot Hall of Famer, over 500 goals, over 500 assists, good kind of guy. But, there's still going to there's a Dave Andreychuk statue outside that building down in Tampa. There's going to be one commemorating Stamkos and Hedman and that they're this championship team. And it's going to be pretty cool when he goes back there to play. I think it'll be an emotional scene.
What's funny? Up until you went into the contract history for Steven Stamkos, I was about to ask you who feels more the right to feel disrespected between Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault, who also was very honest about how things went with him in Vegas. But now it's not even close. I think Steven Stamkos should. But Jonathan Marchessault also not feeling too great with how things went with his former employer. He doesn't feel as if Vegas really did all they could to keep him. And now both Stamkos and Marchessault are teammates again, this time in Nashville. I thought that situation in Vegas was interesting.
Well, if there's 2 teams in the league that would treat players this way, it's Vegas and Tampa. And look at Vegas and Tampa have each won cups in the last few years. Like, I'm not saying this is the wrong way to treat people. Like, again, it's a cutthroat business. It's a bit of a what have you done for me lately business. And if you want to keep trying to win year after year after year, you have to avoid bad contracts. I'm not saying that these are bad contracts that players have signed, but there's definitely some risk with their ages. And, but these guys have a chip on their shoulder now too. So you're not just talking about 2 former cup winners and Marchessault, he's a Conn Smythe winner from 2 years ago, coming off his best season, by the way, in the NHL, his most productive season in the league. And, he only signs for $5.5 million. It's not a crazy deal he signed. And he wanted to stay in Vegas. Like, there's no way around it. Much the way Stamkos, if we had him on the show a month ago, would have told us he wanted to stay in Tampa, and it wasn't a Pinocchio statement. Like, it would be much easier to stay where you've had lots of success, where your family's comfortable. Marchessault has 4 kids. I believe Stamkos has 3. Like, these are big moves for a family, in addition to we're kind of speaking of it from the hockey standpoint. But, the Golden Knights are, almost all the original players are gone, right? They traded Riley Smith last year at the draft, like a week after they won a cup with him, and he was a original Golden Misfit. We saw what happened with Marc-Andre Fleury, beloved goaltender that started there. Even they've just now traded Logan Thompson at the draft right before he was due to sign autographs at the Sphere.
Insane.
And he helped them get in the playoffs this year. I think we can go right across the board. I mean, this is something Vegas has done again and again and again. I don't think they need to make any apologies for it. They've won a lot of games. This is how they operate. I think players know what they're going into. And I think similarly of Julian Breezeball, like he's mentioned, this is what he views his job as, essentially. Like he was asked yesterday, like, how's it feel to be known as the guy who had to basically cut ties with Steven Stamkos in Tampa? And he's like, well, this is the job. Like you get all the flowers when your team goes and wins a cup and you're being voted GM of the year and everyone's talking about how smart you are. But part of being smart sometimes is having to be the bad guy or be the one who's the front facing person from the organization to discuss the decisions that aren't popular in the public opinion, in the court of public opinion. So, yeah, I could see where Marchessault, he's a different case than Stamkos because he was such an unlikely player to become as impactful as he's become. And as a result, he hasn't made as much money in his career. And so I think this free agency for him was about maximizing his value. It's not as though Stamkos actually took a discount here, but I think he could be in more of a position to consider doing that. And, I'm reasonably comfortable in saying that he probably would have taken less to stay in Tampa. But once you're leaving, you might as well get what the market values you at, right? So, two different circumstances, but again, you're getting two accomplished players that are both like, they're going to have a fire under their ass. Like I don't know if they'll use these terms, but I don't think you can see it another way. Like they have something to prove now a little bit more. Like, I think there's a little bit more that goes into their off ice training this year. Like there's going to be a little bit of this element of feeling a bit disrespected, a bit unloved, a bit unwanted by where you were and wanting to, prove something to those people, but also prove that Nashville's right? I mean, the flip side of this coin is they found an organization that rolled out the red carpet for them. And they're trying, like clearly Barry Trotz is trying to win in the short term. Like this, they could have, in an alternate universe in the last 12 months, Nashville could have went into something like a rebuild. Like they traded some players away, right? Like they traded guys away at that deadline a couple of years ago, Granlund and Jeannot and others. Like they started to strip it down. They bought out Duchesne and Johansson was moved on and all the, like they
still almost made the playoffs too. This was 2 years ago where they flipped all those players and they almost still made the playoffs.
Right.
I remember
last year they bring in Ryan O'Reilly, Luke Shen, like kind of character type of signings. Like my point is they've pivoted right back into trying to win again. And if you're a player, that's got to be fun because if you're Marchessault and Stamkos, like Marchessault gets 5-year deal, Stamkos gets 4. I mean, that's the only guaranteed length of your career at this point. So you got to put everything into every year now. And as I say, like, I think I'm going to be fascinated by the Predators next year. Like, I just think this is an interesting experiment. We don't typically see teams built through free agency in the NHL, but this might be one where they got some hits because they didn't score enough last year and they've added two guys that can score. You want to see what Stamkos can do. I mean, Stamkos has clearly benefited, as of the players he played with, by playing on a power play with Kucherov and Point and Hedman so routinely. Like, how does the power play work? Can he score at a 30, 40 goal level still? I mean, like, all these questions will be big burning topics as we get into next season. And so, I think after the emotion of these few days wears off, you're going to find pretty motivated Marchessault and Stamkos heading to Nashville.
This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by Shady Rays. Get ready for the season ahead with quality shades built to last. Our friends at Shady Rays have you covered with premium polarized shades that won't break the bank. Shady Rays is an independent sunglasses company offering a world-class product rated 5 stars by over 300,000 people. Their shades have durable frames and crystal clear optics, making them the perfect choice for all outdoor adventures. And they have hundreds of styles to choose from, so you're bound to find the perfect pair to match your style. I got a pair. I know Adam Wild's got a pair. Steve Dangle's got himself a pair. And look, Sunglasses CJ, he's going to make an appearance at some point, and you'll see him rocking his pair of Shady Rays. Plus, if your shades ever go missing or take an unexpected hit, don't sweat it. They have the most insane protection in all of eyewear. Every pair is backed by lost or broken replacements. If you don't love your shades, exchange them for a new pair, return worry-free within 30 days. It's really great. There's no risk when you shop. Their team always has your back with personal and fast support. ShadyRays.com. Go to that website right now. You can use the code Johnston to get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. ShadyRays.com. Use the code Johnston
for 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Okay, I have one more question before I get to Leafs Corner about Vegas. There seems to be, at least among us in media types, with the reputation with how they kind of go through players, and we were just talking about Jonathan Marchessault and thinking of some of the other golden misfits who have kind of come and gone. Does that extend to the players? Like, if you're a player and you're on the market and you see how certain players have come and gone through that organization, is there a sense between players that they're a little bit cognizant of that and what they could be getting with GM Kelly McCrimmon and the rest of the organization and how that could go? Does that reputation extend to the players?
Maybe a little bit, but I think it's still such an attractive place to play. I mean, you get great weather, great facilities, awesome fan base, a chance to win the Stanley Cup every year, favorable tax situation. I mean, Vegas sells itself. Like, they don't need to put out a pitch video to get free agents to Vegas. What's interesting to me actually is that yesterday was the rare NHL day where Vegas wasn't one of the main characters. Like where they weren't right in the mix, making the Thomas Hertl deal or getting Noah Hannafin or, over the years signing Pietrangelo as on free agency day. They were relatively quiet. And in fact, part of the story is that they let Chandler Stevenson go, who was their first line center. They let Marchessault go, top 6 winger for them. Like, how are they going to replace those guys? I think when we look at potential teams that have to fill some holes, Vegas still has those holes, and you wonder if they maybe get involved in trades, because I think the kind of holes they have aren't really matching the players still left in the open market. I think they need to try to do something more significant. And of course, we know that they're not afraid to do something significant. So, if you walk away with any thought on Vegas, I'd say I found it kind of interesting that they weren't one of the big players in signing guys, because that tells me that they're going to have to be doing something else. But, I don't think players are ignoring it. Like Vegas was pitching Stamkos, Anaheim was pitching Stamkos, New Jersey was pitching Stamkos.
Anaheim, wow.
I mean, why not? His good friend Alex Killorn is there.
That's true.
The Ducks want to get better. The Ducks aren't trying to finish at the bottom of the league next year. I'm not predicting they're going to surge up the standings necessarily either, but they're in a building mode and they want the right people around their young players. So, but like losing out to Nashville is pretty understandable too. It's a different lifestyle, but it's similar, checks a lot of the same boxes. And a lot of hockey people are settling in Nashville, actually. Like Nashville's like a sneaky hockey town these days. It's kind of like how a lot of you got NHLers coming out of Arizona because so many players stayed there into retirement. I could see that happening for Nashville, especially as they build more community rinks and the like in that state, because so many NHL people are retiring there. And so, not that I'm saying Marchessault and Stamkos are retiring there, but they're definitely moving there to play, and it's a pretty nice place to play.
All right, let's get to Leafs Corner. They get Chris Tanev. They sign him to a 6-year deal, $27 million. Max Domi's coming back. Nick Robertson seems like he wants out. Oliver Ekman-Larsson joins. Yanni Hakanpää. There's a lot to get to when it comes to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let's start with Chris Tanev's deal, though. Why did he sign for that long? Can we explain that a little bit?
Well, I mean, he's a really in-demand player. So, at free agency, you got to stretch yourself sometimes. And obviously the Leafs traded for his rights and signed him before he hit the open market. But, to keep him from hitting the open market, they had to put a contract in front of him that made sense. And so, I don't have as much problem with this length of this deal as everyone else seems to. I think that, Chris Tanev has been wildly effective and efficient through age 31, 32, 33, into age 34. I mean, he was a real difference maker in Dallas after the trade over from Calgary last season. So, there's nothing in his game to suggest it can't age. I think the question would be just durability, like because he plays such an unforgiving style physically, throws himself in front of pucks, completes checks, battles, does all the things in the game defensively that show up in him being one of the best defensive defensemen, if not the best in the league. To me, it's exactly the type of player the Leafs need. I think it's going to do wonders for Morgan Rielly, having a partner like that. He had Riley's had some partners. Like when TJ Brody first signed in Toronto, they had a couple highly successful years, but he's also had a revolving door of partners. I mean, Ron Hainsey was his partner for a time. Roman Polak was his partner for a time. He had Ilya Lyubushkin, 2 different stints. He had Dion Phaneuf back in the day. Jeez. I'm sure I'm missing a few others. You know, I mean, Morgan's played on the Leafs for so long. It's only natural that he's going to cycle through different partners, but I would wager to say he's never had a partner better suited to sort of counterbalance his game than Chris Tanev, which I think frees him up in some ways. Should be good for the Leafs, you know, down the lineup. I like what Toronto's did on day one of free agency. I think that Brad Treliving was successful in starting to reshape his blue line. It still feels a little incomplete, which is fine. I mean, it's only July 2nd, still 99 days to the Leafs' first game of the regular season. So I have to remind Steve Dangle of that in the group chat. He's been particularly negative lately. And it's like, I get it. Like, I'm not saying you look at the Leafs' first day of free agency and they're the favorite to win the cup, but I mean, you have to build incrementally. I think his frustration, honestly, is more just built up over the years versus what happened in the last 72 hours. Because I like the Max Domi deal that Toronto signed, and I like what you're starting to see the blue line could be. I don't mind the bet on Anthony Stolarz and net to be alongside Joseph Woll.
Him too.
You know, pretty athletic guy, Stolarz, for 6'6", and he's played a lot of good hockey. I mean, he's just never been someone to be a 1A starter, but I'm not sure that's what the Leafs need. I mean, they believe they have that in Joseph Woll if he can stay healthy, because he's had a variety of injury ailments, right? It's not like you're like, well, he's just got a bad knee that he's got to manage. It's like, no, he's been injured all over his body, and you just wonder if he can string together a fully healthy season. But I think it was a good start to the free agency period for the Leafs. As I said, they were definitely having conversations, or had a conversation on Skinner, on Henrique. I think that you're probably looking to add another forward to this mix, probably one that can play on the left wing. But you know, there's still today and many more days before we see what their exact plans are for the roster.
What about for Nick Robertson and the fact that he might not want to continue his career in Leafs colors?
Well, I reported that. I mean, he definitely doesn't want to continue his career. He's told the team he doesn't intend to resign this summer. The Leafs gave him a qualifying offer, so they have his rights. He's a restricted free agent. And the reality is this: Nick Robertson only has so many rights. I mean, he can request a trade. He can make it known publicly that he's not happy, that he's frustrated, that he feels he should have more opportunity, that he wants a fresh start. All those things are fair. But the Leafs are not compelled by anything in the rules that they have to trade him. And so, you know, I think that they'll look out there to see if anything makes sense. But they're not giving him away for nothing just to, you know, because there's a bit of public pressure on them, or because of, you know, this has become public. And so there's a world where it gets to September and he hasn't been traded, and then Nick Robertson has a decision to make. Does he want to hold out, potentially jeopardize a year of his NHL career? Or does he want to maybe try to make it work for one more year? Because I think the reality is there's actually more opportunity in front of him than there's ever been in Toronto. As I mentioned, they need another left winger. They've just seen Tyler Bertuzzi walk in free agency to Chicago. You know, you've still got Matthew Nyes. You've got Max Domi re-signed. I mean, he can be either a center, probably on the third line, or you know, in the top 6 on the left wing. But you know, like there's not a ton of guys ahead of him. Maybe Bobby McMahon, but you know, I think that there's Nick Robertson's frustration comes out of the fact that no forward on the Leafs played last year other than Ryan Reeves, and he still scored 14 goals, 13 of them were at even strength. Like, he wasn't given power play minutes, nor I think should he have been. If you look at his teammates, it's hard to argue that he should have been on the power play ahead of some of those guys. And the Leafs don't use their second power play too much because they like to give that top unit a minute 30 plus, which is what a lot of the best teams do. I just watched Edmonton's power play up close and personal. Connor McDavid, Zach Hyman, and company aren't coming off the ice before 2 minutes unless they score. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is just how it is. But Nick was also scratched in Game 7, so I can understand his frustration. I don't think it's misplaced, but the reality is he and they might have to find a way to continue on together, because there's no guarantee there's going to be a trade out there that makes sense and that sees him get that fresh start that he desires.
Okay, what about Yanni Hakanpää? There was a column from Steve Simmons yesterday where he essentially suggesting that even though the Leafs signed him, the injury history might be too big for him to ever play again, since he hasn't really played since March. What did you make of that tidbit and the signing?
Well, I think that it may have been a little overstated. I actually didn't read the column. Sorry, it's been so busy. And
no, for what it's worth, I only saw that tidbit going around too.
Yeah, and I only know that the tidbit was sort of like his career is over. Like, I don't think that's the case. Obviously, before signing a player like this, the Leafs get a look at some of the medical records. Now, that's not to say there isn't risk there, because he last played in mid-March and wasn't able to come back on the Stars playoff run. And he has had injuries in the past, and he is 32, I believe. Like, there's definitely some risks there, but the Leafs also got him at a pretty good number, right? I mean, $1.5 million can almost be buried in most of its entirety in the American Hockey League if it has to be. And obviously, if he is injured for the year, then, they place him on LTIR. So I look at it as a calculated bet. He's a 6'7" right shot defenseman. He's a third pairing guy. I mean, he's not going to threaten for the Norris Trophy, but if the Leafs believe very highly that they have some of the best sports science and medical people in the game, I think that they spend as much or more in those areas as anyone. I think going way back, Tyler Ennis, I remember coming to Toronto, I think he had a lot of hip issues, talked about how he felt like the Leafs training staff was able to extend his career. He moved on after Toronto, but had a pretty good year here. I mean, I think the Leafs are betting on their ability to get him healthy, and maybe that they found a little bit of value here if he can be healthy. And so certainly there's some risk given the age of the player and the injury history of the player, but it's hard to argue it isn't a risk worth taking, because I do think if he's able to play on their third pairing, making $1.5 million, that's a pretty good bargain for Toronto.
Okay. Anything else on the Leafs before we wrap up Leafs Corner?
No, I just say Mitch Marner is more likely than not to return to the team. We've hit this thing ad nauseum. We'll see how things develop now that time goes along. But I still don't believe that I think that they are comfortable with Mitch Marner returning if that's how things turn out. If there isn't enough interest or a trade that even kind of makes sense. And I do think they're still going to sign some more sort of depth type of players here in free agency. And we'll see how the Robertson situation manifests itself. We'll see if Timothy Liljegren maybe still gets traded. I know he was signed to a 2-year extension, but I don't think you can entirely rule out a trade in his circumstance yet. And so, they're still going to keep chipping away at the roster, but I think they got off to a pretty good start here. And, I think that they feel pretty good about the team, that the sort of the structure of the team that's now in place. I mean, don't overlook the Oliver Ekman-Larsson signing either. I mean, that's someone who can play on the second power play, really was rejuvenated in Florida last year. Good puck mover, which is one area where the Leafs have, I think, fallen short at times in the playoffs. Is, they have the talented forwards, but maybe getting it out of their own end, getting the clean exits, getting the puck into the hands of their forwards hasn't always been there. I think OEL helps with that, and not a crazy number for him. Obviously, he got a bit of a raise, but he earned that raise. He just played big minutes on a team that won a Stanley Cup after being bought out in Vancouver, and so be interesting to see him in a Canadian market again. I think he's seen in both worlds, right? Arizona, Vancouver, Florida, Toronto. I mean, it's a nice tour around the national for OEL.
All right, let's go through some quick thoughts on some other teams on my big rundown here. We'll go through some more Canadian teams. I want to start in Edmonton. Jeff Skinner, we've mentioned him already. Troy Stetcher and Connor Brown are staying. Josh Brown joins. Victor Arvidsson's probably the biggest signing they made yesterday. I also want to touch off on Evander Kane and his future too. What did you think of Edmonton's day in free agency, and what could be next for Evander Kane?
Well, I don't know if they can move his contract. I mean, it's pretty clear. Look, he wasn't healthy. He wasn't able to play the last, I think, 5 games of the Cup final. Not sure if the organizational fit is as good as it once was there for Evander Kane. But that being said, we'll just have to see, what happens. If he can be moved, I'm sure they would consider it. But I know they also like Evander Kane. Like when he was healthy, he was pretty effective for the Oilers. I mean, if anything, they're probably ruining the fact he just, had the groin or hernia type issue, sports hernia, I think it was, that limited him and kept him out of the biggest games of the final. I mean, maybe he could have chipped in the 1 or 2 more goals that could have been the difference to finding a way to beat Florida. So, I think it's a bit of a TBD on Kane's future. But the Oilers, I think, as a whole, have improved their team, a little more skilled. I expect them to be a better rush team. I mean, Arvidsson, there's some risks there. I mean, it's similar to the Hakanpää conversation in that, he was limited last year by a couple different injuries in Los Angeles, didn't play a lot of games, veteran player, but man, he's a tenacious guy, gets in on the forecheck. He can score some goals, got a nice shot. He complements the kind of players that Edmonton has quite nicely. And I know they're excited to get him in there along with Jeff Skinner, who, I think could really pop at Edmonton. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of defensive impact on the game, but, really can shoot the puck and scored a ton of goals in the league. Hasn't played a playoff game. He's got over 1,000 games on his resume in the regular season, but presumably will be playing his first playoff game next spring in Edmonton. So, I'm sure he's going to be energized by this opportunity after being bought out by the Sabres. So, I think it was a good day for the Oilers and sort of the same as the Leafs. So they'll continue to look around, see maybe if there's some upgrades on the blue line. We'll see if Kane trades out there. I'm a little skeptical about that. But, they've managed to keep the right players. I mean, Janmark and Brown were 2/3 of their best line in the playoffs, along with Henrique. So they kept the whole line. Not to say they'll necessarily play the line all next season, but they've kept the ingredients of that line in place, and they didn't spend a ton of money to do so. So look, they've still got to hire their general manager, and they've got to figure out what happens with Draisaitl. And there's still some big questions in Edmonton, but hard for me not to argue that's a pretty A+ day on the opening day of free agency, because they didn't sign anything that's too risky to me. They brought back Corey Perry too. We didn't mention.
Yes.
But none of those contracts on the surface, it's not like they're immovable. I mean, most of them could be buried in the minors if anything goes wrong. And I don't think that's going to need to be the case. I think they had a nice day.
Yep. Matthias Janmark also part of the players coming back as well. What about the Vancouver Canucks? They signed Jake DeBrusk and a few other guys as well. What did you think of their day?
Well, they were linked to maybe being interested in Gensel. Obviously, that was off the table before free agency even opened. I think DeBrusk is a pretty good fallback. And, I note you the terms of his deal, 7-year deal at $5.5 million, the exact same contract Zach Hyman signed a few years ago in Edmonton. And, what happened to Hyman is, with new line mates and a new situation, he took his game and his production to another level. I think Vancouver is banking on something similar. Not to say he's going to be a 50 goal scorer. I'm not saying it's not exactly apples to apples, but in a similar vein, he's being brought in now to be a top line winger for them, to play alongside presumably Elias Pettersson. Going to get power play minutes. He's got a chance to blossom a little bit. And at his best, Jake DeBrusk has been pretty damn good in the NHL. I think he's struggled at times with some consistency issues. Had some problems once upon a time with Bruce Cassidy. They didn't always see eye to eye in Boston. But he's a great kid, and he's got a nice skill set. And I do think that in a different circumstance now, he's going to probably play more minutes with better line mates more consistently. Vancouver's counting on him to even take another step in his production and helping their team. And so I like the move. I think it makes a lot of sense. 7-year deal, a little bit of risk there, but you're signing him. He was a young free agent, right? He's 27 years old. So, you're not signing him for the crazy aging curve years. I mean, it's going to be a challenge maybe as the contract goes along, but $5.5 million, I think they can live with. They also sort of a sneaky signing is Danton Heinen, another player out of Boston, who's a local kid from Vancouver. He was a PTO in Boston last year. And so he gets a nice deal to go back to his hometown team. I mean, I like the day for the Canucks. They lose a couple players in free agency. Ian Cole goes to Utah. They signed Vincent Desharnais though, from Edmonton. So, I think that the Canucks, everything they did was reasonable. It makes sense to me. And, maybe they're a team to look for a trade if something that could still happen. I think they're still going to be pretty aggressive out there, but they didn't sign any deals that made me go, uh-oh. And frankly, I think DeBrusk is a pretty safe it's an understandable bet for where they're at and the kind of opportunity they have to offer them.
Was there a team or contract out there that made you say, uh-oh?
Well, Seattle maybe jumps to mind. I think they're under pressure to get back to the playoffs, to take a step forward. Signing both Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour to 7-year deals. Like, I don't think it's going to be a rut row next season, but when we get to 3 and 4 and 5 years down the road, we might look back on those deals and say those were big swings, maybe overly aggressive swings. So it's just because of the age of those players and the amount of mileage on them. That being said, they're two players that have won a Stanley Cup, Stevenson in Vegas and Montour, obviously recently here in Florida. You know, Montour is a great puck moving D. Stevenson's a very, strong two-way centerman who's put up some points the last 2 or 3 years, been a 50, 60 point guy. So I can understand why they signed them. And I think that it's a sign of Seattle really needing to be a good team next year. But those are two of the deals that, like, if I'm going to guess that we might be talking about ones that don't age amazing, could be both of those two. Maybe I'm wrong though. What do I know? I mean, it's just 7-year contracts for players in their 30s generally are not going to be good. Like that's all I'm going off of. I'm not chipping away at those individuals as much as I'm just thinking those were big swings. But, Stevenson had a lot of interest in him. I know St. Louis was talking to him. Nashville was before they signed both Marchessault and Stamkos. He had options. Montour similarly had options. I think he was a chance to go to Utah, maybe before Utah, talk about a team that built a blue line overnight. I mean, trading for Sergachev and Marino, re-signing in this case, Kesselring, Dursey, who am I missing? They signed Ian Cole yesterday in free agency. I mean, they like filled out a blue line. It's like a fantasy draft. Like in 7 days, they went from having no defenseman signed to a pretty good looking blue line on paper in Utah. I think that there'll be another team to watch next year. Actually, kind of like what they've done. I don't see them necessarily being a playoff team next year, but certainly see them being better than the final season of the Coyotes. Pour one out for Mullet Arena, which didn't help that the Coyotes had a 13 or 14 game losing streak at one point when they were dealing with all that stuff.
Yeah, RIP to the Coyotes. One other contract that gave me pause, the 6-year contract doled out to Nikita Zadorov, who great character to deal with for media. We saw the exploits in Vancouver this past postseason, but I still think he's a guy who is really just a really good third pairing defenseman. You really only put him in a second pair in a pinch, and now he's in Boston on a 6-year deal with a $5 million AAV. I'm very curious to see how that deal shakes out. Also, Elias Lindholm signing in Boston too. This is a guy who I thought was going to make like $8.7 million on his contract last year. If you asked me this at this time last year, and he's now at 7.75, I should say, not to get anyone confused with the dollar amounts, but he had a very interesting situation that led him to Boston as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a good fit for him in Boston, though. I mean, that's a team that can use what he does. 7.75 makes the length of the deal maybe a little more palatable, because if the cap keeps rising as we're expecting it to, I don't think 7.75 is going to be silly money in 5 years. But yeah, it's the same risk as those two Seattle contracts. It's just the players are a little bit older and they're long-term deals. Zadorov, it's a reflection of how much interest was in him. I mean, the Leafs were interested there. Vancouver was interested in retaining him. I think there was 10 or so teams that inquired at one point on Nikita Zadorov, and most of the teams weren't willing to get to 6 years and $5 million, but that's what Boston had to do to get him. And, it's like the Leafs giving Tanev 6 years with obvious risk at the tail end risk of that contract. I mean, the market is not like it's not consistent, right? From year to year. Sean Monahan, it looks like one thing, and then he's $5.5 million times 5 in Columbus in this year's marketplace. I mean, that's just, it really is a supply demand dynamic. It's to do with how much money's in the system. And, I can see where we're talking about one or more of those contracts we just mentioned one day, maybe being bought out or what have you. I mean, that's the reality of the day. I mean, Gord Miller actually said it at the very top of our show yesterday. He's like, we just come through this day where teams have spent draft picks and all this money buying out contracts or unloading contracts and trades. Now they're going to give out contracts that they might have to do the same with. I mean, that's the reality of it.
Yep. What about the
one day I hope to be overpaid, though. I hope one day someone gives me too much money in too many years. Like I'll deal with that problem if that ever happens.
Would you rather be overpaid or underrated?
Oh man, I didn't know there'd be like a brain teaser.
I just quoted a rap lyric. I didn't expect you to answer.
I'll stick with overpaid.
All right. Very quickly, the New Jersey Devils, Brett Pesce, Brendan Dillon among the moves made yesterday. What do you think of what they did?
Well, the Devils, they're kind of like where the Panthers were a couple years ago. Like, I think that they look at themselves that they have to play a little differently. Obviously they're trying to get better, but the way they think they can get better is not by necessarily finding ways to score more goals, but maybe playing in a different style, being ready for playoff style hockey. Defensively, they were a disaster last season. Some of that was brought on by players that left in free agency last summer. Some of that's brought on by not having Dougie Hamilton for most of the season, in addition to other injuries they dealt with. So I like where they're thinking. I really, when you pair it with adding Jacob Markstrom to the mix to solidify their goaltending, I like where the Devils sit. This has always been a Devils friendly pod because I was big on them 2 years ago when they had that unexpected run to the playoffs and won a round. Like, I'm a believer. I like that team. I think they have a very well run, smart front office. And I like the deals they made. I don't think there's anything too crazy in the contracts. And ultimately, I see them as one of the teams that's going to be on the up next year in the East. I mean, they probably would have been anyway, just by a function of probably being healthier, another year older for their star players. They made the coaching change with Sheldon Keefe. I think Sheldon's shown himself to be a really effective coach, and I expect him to have a positive impact on that group. And then you add a frontline goaltender and, pretty top end defender and Pesce. Dillon's a nice, secondary piece on the blue line. Like, it's hard not to like the Devils. And yet, I think that they were in there at least a little bit on Stamkos. Like, I wonder if we still see them try to make a move to add something of impact to their forward group.
Yeah, we've went through so much on today's edition of the CJ Show. To everyone who sent in questions for Ask CJ, we're going to move that to Thursday just because this episode did run long, but there's a ton of, so if you didn't get a question, you were thinking about getting a question in, still keep sending them, whether on Discord or Twitter. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we can for Thursday's episode. Because
it's better for Thursday anyway, because I am still so dead.
Yeah, I could tell. I could tell, and not as a bad thing, because I think you've been incredible throughout every episode we've done as you've gone through your world tour throughout May and June and into July. But yeah, you definitely need some rest.
I've never had a month like that one work wise, so it's
I'm just happy you got out of Vegas.
It was not even an issue for me.
Well, there was an issue for some people. That's why I'm happy.
But I feel like it affected like 20% or less of the people. Like, my point is, if I didn't know anything was wrong, I wouldn't know anything was wrong. Like, I went to the airport like normal. My flight took off.
Well, you didn't fly on WestJet, clearly.
Dude, I never fly on that airline. I'm not kidding. Like, it's been more than 10 years since I got on that airline.
Man, I think I'm going to have to start that too, just because.
Well, you live in the West, so that's the other thing. Like,
right.
It makes more sense for you. Like, it's not as much of an option here in Toronto, but I had some bad experiences on it a long time ago, and so I just swore off the thing.
Yeah, between not getting on a flight this year because of broken toilets and a mechanic strike, I think I've had my fill with WestJet for the time being. I've had my fill with them, and
we're down one potential sponsor.
But you say potentially 20%. Like, this isn't just like media people complaining about this. Like, I know of at least one NHL team that struggled to get all their guys back through WestJet. Like, this wasn't just little old me wondering about my situation. This was something that affected a substantial amount of people getting home. But yeah, this was a bit of a weird situation.
That's why some teams were smart to stay in Vegas, I think.
Yes, I agree with that.
Especially
I definitely agree with that.
Actually, it wasn't all Eastern teams, because I know Edmonton's front office stayed in Vegas, Washington stayed in Vegas, Toronto stayed in Vegas. There were others, though, I'm sure. And it was just a lot to cram in. Like, even I flew home on the 30th, and like, it's basically the entire day when you're going west to east. And like, there's lots of news. Like, I had like spotty airplane Wi-Fi, like trying to.
Ooh, the worst.
Well, I mean, it's a first world problem, but I'm just saying, on a day where you really want to be connected to your phone, it was a challenge, but somehow we got here, man. July 2nd, like, summer is upon us. I'm going to bed. I went to bed at 8:30 last night. I'm going to do at least 2 more nights of that. And by the time I see you Thursday, I'll be in full sunglasses, CJ, chilled out mode. But I'm still in recovery from that month. My goodness.
Yeah, I something about that Vegas trip has tired me out, but it pales in comparison to what you've gone through this last little while. So I'm looking forward to Thursday when you get the sunglasses on, and because you have the sunglasses on, it'll be even funnier when you get these questions for Ask.
That's what I'm saying. I'll be in a better frame of mind to answer the goofy queries. Bring them on.
For sure. But there's definitely going to be some other hockey questions as well. Keep them coming.
I met some 100%ers at the draft, by the way.
Yeah. Shout out to the 100%ers as well. Shout out to
there's
them.
like some from California that were there.
Nice.
It's still wild that anyone listens. So thank you for your time. Thank you. I mean, we're not wrapping for the season yet, so we don't have to give the big thank you, but honestly, thank you for giving us all your time this year. Cause this has actually been, we didn't reflect on it because we've been so in the weeds on everything, but like, this is one of the best NHL seasons I can remember. I think just from top to bottom, like there was so much interesting, compelling things happening. Had a pretty good trade deadline, pretty good free agency day. Like there's a lot going on in the league. That was a fun 23-24 to cover.
I believe we have 2 more episodes before we go away for the summer because we're going to do a Thursday episode, and I believe by the 10th you're gone.
Yeah, 11th I think I fly.
We'll get into your summer plans before you leave. For CJ, I'm Julian. Oh, I was going to wrap up. Are you going to say something? Oh, you're just going to do the peace sign. All right, we out, everybody. See you Thursday.
The Chris Johnston Show. Inside the game, twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris. And follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.